I thought I would do a presentation on Grover Cleveland, the 22nd and 24th President of the United States, because he's the only other president besides Trump, if he's elected this November, to have served two terms, but with an intervening term in which he wasn't the president. So, in other words, two terms spanning 12 years. So, and it's interesting for his life is interesting for other parallels too that hopefully will become apparent in the course of this discourse. Um, and I think it could be of interest to some people, partly because it's the late 19th century is, I think most people are, like me, somewhat ignorant of the goings on. Um, and in particular, um, looking for differences between America at that time. And there's always a story. Anytime something changes, there's a story. And that's important for us to start thinking about. Or other areas where things have kind of, the more they've changed, the more they've stayed the same. So both aspects are interesting. It's basically a review of this book by Robert McElroy, who was a professor at Princeton University. And this was, as I said, published in 1923. I bought this on a used book stand a few years ago, and it sat on my shelf. When I finally read it, I discovered that every chapter I had to take a knife and cut the folded leaves apart, meaning that it's sat on someone else's shelf for 100 years, literally, without being read. So I guess I have a first edition here. The picture that's in front of Grover Cleveland, I'll show you. That's what he looked like. Notice he was somewhat of a portly man. This was after 20 years after the Civil War. And when you look at portraits during the Civil War, both North and South, most men had more of a gaunt, very lean kind of look to them. You know, whether Lincoln or Sherman. I guess Robert E. Lee had a slightly corpulent look about him. But we're coming into the part of America of the rise of industrialism, strong prosperity, and with that comes fine food. So that's just a kind of a remark in passing. I find that he looks a bit like G.K. Chesterton of the next generation. G.K. Chesterton looks like that. He has a little bit of that kind of look to him. So he was born in 1837 and christened as Stephen Grover Cleveland, but apparently always went by Grover. Um, his family was devout participants in the Reformed or Presbyterian faith. His father was a minister, in fact. His family was very pious and devout in the Reformed tradition. They were Sabbath keepers, meaning had a very rigid observance of Sunday as a day of worship and meditation and fellowship and avoiding worldly recreations. Um, they also memorized, the children were made to memorize the Westminster Catechism. So it's interesting, again, kind of doing a compare and contrast to politicians of recent years. Um, I don't see that deep Puritan piety characterizing Grover Cleveland's life. He does seem to have remained a believer in God and a man of prayer, but at least the way McElroy presents his life, some of that Puritan, um, single-minded devotion does not appear to have been embraced by him. He seems to have been a little bit more like we often see in the second or third generation of Reformed, deeply affected Reformed communities, where there's a little bit of a pulling back in the direction of Stoicism and, kind of like retaining the hard work and discipline and saving and thriftiness and some of those attributes, but without the hot ember of devotional piety. Again, I can't say that he did not have that, and in fact, there'll be an anecdote that I'll talk about later on when he runs for president. That's interesting, but it's not. It doesn't seem to characterize his life, at least the way as McElroy, this author, presents him. He was born in New Jersey, but his father took parishes in Connecticut, Baltimore, Virginia, and New Jersey, and finally settled in the northern Finger Lakes area of New York. And even then, there were several moves, but by the time Grover Cleveland reached boyhood and his formative years, they were tended to be small towns stretching out but in that swath between Rochester and Syracuse, kind of in that northern central part of New York State. He was a very hard worker. In fact, he, because of family duties of support and just the need to earn a living, he never went to college. But when he reached the age of setting out on his own, he went west, or intended to go west, intending to go to Cleveland, which was named after General Moses Cleveland, one of his kinsmen. I'm not sure if that was a motivating factor or just coincidental, but at any rate, he was intercepted in Buffalo on his way to Cleveland by another kinsman who prevailed upon him to come work for him. So he provided employment, and Grover ended up settling in Buffalo, smaller town than Cleveland. And it kind of reminds me of how in that movie Run Lola Run, or Lola Rennt in German, how just the smallest little change in one's history, or at least according to that movie, and I think with some legitimacy, just the slightest little change can lead to a drastically different outcome. So who knows what would have happened if Grover Cleveland had continued on to the city of Cleveland. But at any rate, he distinguished himself for hard work, and he decided to read law. And at that period of history, reading law literally meant that you would get hired by a law firm and do clerical duties, but then also be reading books on law and getting kind of private tutorial from the senior law partners, and eventually be able to pass the bar. And my grandfather, whom I never met, he passed away before I was born, but he had been a lawyer in North Dakota, I believe under the same circumstances, just kind of getting up law. It didn't have this long bachelor degree requirement followed by 3 years of school at that time. Well, at the age of 19, the Republican Party was formed, and his kinsman became a Republican. But at that time, Grover Cleveland threw his lot in with the Democratic Party. And the book doesn't explain a lot of his youthful reasoning. I'm just guessing that the Democratic Party already had many a decade's history by that time, and the Republican Party was an upstart endeavor, building on the ruins of the Free Party and the Whig Party, other failed parties in America, but basically a new start. And he must not have found the arguments for this new start to be compelling, probably, so he threw his lot in with the party of Jefferson and Jackson. In 1863, he had he was appointed to be the assistant DA of Erie County. Apparently, the Bar Association filled that position, and he was politically active, but already known as being a fair-minded, like with an eye toward justice for all. And so he was appointed to that position. He became distinguished there for memorizing his cases even if he has to stay up all night, and being able to deliver them very flawlessly in court. Note that this was in 1863, which was right in the middle of the Civil War, and it's a good reminder that life continued to go on. You know, um, people still had jobs, people still worked for local government. There were still criminal cases being tried in court, and people being sentenced, going to jail, or being let off. Um, Even though the war was raging at this very time. Um, in 1865, he ran for the full Byrd DA position. So apparently the assistant DA would be appointed, but the full DA was subject to election. He ran for this at the age of 28, but was defeated. Um, in 1870, he was elected the sheriff in a heavily Republican district. He was again recognized by this time by people of both parties as being sort of above the fray, above the corruption. And his term as sheriff was further distinguished by two things. First of all, he didn't use his power of giving contracts or making appointments in a purely partisan way. So in other words, he always resisted. He already showed himself resistant to the spoils system. And the other thing was financial lack of corruption. So he would put out for bid jobs that everybody assumed would be kind of like slipped under the table and get the contract given to cronies and so forth. And so this we'll see to be a theme throughout the rest of his political career, is that he became the Democratic vanguard, but yet he was kind of despised and rejected by many of the Democratic players who expected to get the payoff on an election. This was a serious problem in our country. Grant had faced it, and apparently made some first efforts at reforming the civil service at the high level. But even down at the sheriff's level of a fairly small city, this was a serious problem. So anyway, that lasted, I think, for a couple of years, and then he went back to law practice for 8 years. But in 1881, he was elected as the mayor of Buffalo. And here again, the city council of Buffalo included both Democrats and Republicans, and it was just fully infested with corruption of giving out contracts to unworthy favored friends and allies, and even just spending public money on projects that never really got done. Just the payoff happened, but not the work. And so he was sponsored for this position of mayor by right-thinking men of influence in both parties. It was kind of a bipartisan motion that got him elected. And a few of the achievements of him as mayor are interesting because they kind of cast light on his character. One was the reconstruction of the waterworks. So at that time, they had different wells drawn at different parts of the city with pumps that would pump water up for the city. And then again, the contracts would be given for maintenance and replacing the pumps and redigging wells and things like that. And it had come about that the poorer sections of the town had brackish water often and didn't get the attention that, the more well-heeled sections did. And Grover Cleveland resisted this, and he insisted that, in fact, he sponsored an effort to bring fresh water down from the Niagara and, fill the waterworks with fresh water, but with a particular eye toward the poorer sections of town. Another area that's interesting was in the street cleaning contracts. He there again, he put these out to bid for the lowest bidder rather than just giving favors to the crony businesses. And it's kind of interesting because, trash collection, which is kind of the modern equivalent of street cleaning, now that we have asphalt paved roads, has always been an area infiltrated by organized crime. And not just in America. Like New York is famous for this, but in Italy also. And I guess it's because once you get the contract and you have a margin between the wage that a man is willing to work for versus the wage that the city is willing to pay, that's a gap there that is just begging to be stolen, basically, by corrupt union officials and criminals. And this was already, a problem. I don't know if it was organized crime, but just the cronyism aspect of it was already a problem in the 1880s. And then the third point that the author points out during his period as mayor was just kind of an oblique line on his character. He studied a case of a man that was convicted of murder of his employer named Flanagan, and became convinced that the evidence had been not properly presented, that the case had been carried out wrongly in a way such that Flanagan might very well be innocent and wrongly convicted. And he spent a great deal of time researching this case and eventually appearing in person with some assistance before the governor of New York, pleading for a pardon, and I believe achieved that. But I guess the point, whether the governor yielded to his demands or not, it shows that even though he was a rising star in the Democratic Party, which was at that time the Conservative Party, this did not mean just like always siding on the law and order side, if you think of that as a divide, but that he had a real eye for proper administration of justice and taking the cause of the accused that could be falsely accused. At this point, there might be some viewers that aren't aware of the fact of the Democratic and Republican Party, what they represent during the 19th century. So I thought I would just take a quick minute to explain that. Forgive me those that do know a lot about our history. But to first approximation, you could almost say that the Democratic and Republican parties have swapped positions since the late 19th century. In other words, the Democratic Party was kind of like the Conservative Party and the Republican was the Radical Party. Now, that's not quite right. If I was going to do a presentation on the history of these parties, it's more like a dance where they've kind of turned 90 degrees. There's still some very good themes within the Democratic Party today, inherited from the 19th century, and there's still some wickedness of the Republican Party inherited from the original party of the 19th century. But in general, you can almost say that the parties have swapped as far as kind of an intuitive general view of the world, the view of the common man, the working man, the American versus the corporation, things like that. So, for example, the Democratic Party would have had its eye more on the yeoman and the common man of America, whereas the Republican Party would have had the eye more on corporations and power, greasing the skids for the power brokers and corporations and capitalists and so forth. And we'll see that play out in this history as it continues. In 1882, so now this would be during the Rutherford B. Hayes had become president in 76 through 80, and then General Garfield had been elected in 1880, and within a year or so had been assassinated and succeeded by Chester Arthur. So this was just about the time that Chester Arthur would have been assuming the presidency due to the assassination of Garfield. Grover Cleveland was elected as the governor of New York. And it's interesting because the Republican was the hand-picked guy by Chester Arthur, and he was going to handpick the governor of New York, who would then pave the way for his rise into power. And so Grover Cleveland was pressed into service by lovers of the democracy, as it was called. And there was three main candidates, but he somehow, the two other candidates in the Democratic primary were way ahead of Grover Cleveland as far as the number of delegate votes and so forth. But because of their fighting it out, Grover Cleveland was able to kind of sneak up from the middle and behind and defeat both of them for the nomination. And then he went on to win the election. So I'll just mention a couple of features of his governorship. He was again distinguished for not following the dictates of the spoils system. So there again, a theme that we'll see throughout his life is that because he saw himself as a trustee for the people, in this case of the whole state of New York, he was extremely resistant to just giving out contracts or appointments or positions to fellow party members, even if they had worked hard on the campaign and so forth, because he felt like that was violating the trust that he had of the Americans. So as a result, he would alienate many people in his own party, even though he was a very popular representative of that party. That's one of the dynamics that we need to understand going through here. The second feature that I'll mention here is that he had a very even-handed adjustment between corporations and the public. Again, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, but let me read a section from the author's summary here. McElroy says, Grover Cleveland, in the 2 years of his governorship, impressed the people with both his honesty and his wisdom, and to these he added the quality of courage which gave a touch of the dramatic so essential to political success. He dared to defend the rights of smallholders and of the state against the unjust demands of corporations. But he was equally ready to face the less popular duty of defending the rights of corporations when the public, misled by demagogues or by the no less dangerous valor of ignorance, clamored for their destruction. So this is a key point. He everything else being equal, he would always side with the common man, but not to the point of allowing demagoguery or just kind of a raw populism pushing him to an action against corporations which would violate the law or charters or that kind of thing. And so one example was when the First National Bank of Buffalo failed, he didn't rush to their defense. He let them fail. But another, on the other side, there was the controversy in New York City known as the 5-cent fare bill. And this was because the public transportation, which they already had back then, trains essentially, charged 10 cents for one of the long lines that many of the workers needed to use to go between work and home. And there was a tremendous pressure to reduce that fare to 5 cents because some of the shorter lines were only 5 cents. And there was a widespread feeling that this was unfair. Well, Grover Cleveland studied the matter real intensely, as he always did, looking at the law, looking at the charters, looking at the paperwork, and decided that the charter of the corporation that ran the railroads was completely within their rights to charge 10 cents, and therefore he would be acting unjustly to intervene as governor and force them to lower the rate to 5 cents, even though it would have been a very popular thing to do. And so this would be another example, I think, of how he was extremely principled. So already by the end of his governorship, which was only 2 years, already that's when they pressed him into service to run for president. And he was pulled in because, well, first of all, the Democrats had been out of power since the election of Lincoln by a minority in 1860. So for 24 years, Republicans had held complete hegemony, with the exception of that brief period that Andrew Johnson was sort of a lame duck president after Lincoln was assassinated. But apart from that, Republicans had held won every election. Of course, the one of '76 was disputed, and the compromise was worked out with Rutherford B. Hayes. But the point is that the office was held by Republicans. So the Democrats were starting to get a little bit desperate. And the thing that pulled everybody together that allowed Grover Cleveland to win was, first of all, a faction of the Republicans known as the Mugwumps. And the Mugwumps, as best as I can make out from a Google search, McElroy doesn't explain this, but I guess it's an Indian name for the big man or the honchos. But at any rate, this was a faction of Republicans, but Republicans that had a good heart, that wanted things to be done above board. And so because of the corruption and cronyism that had crept in from this long, long rule of Republicans, the Mugwumps promised to support a Democrat if the Democrat would be running on an anti-corruption platform. And so that gave Grover Cleveland a real argument. The other force was the Tammany Hall faction of New York City, which was sort of I'm not completely sure, and he doesn't explain, but it's sort of a association of Irish laborers and politicos in New York that tried to be kingmakers. And so they would try to vote as a bloc within local and state politics to extract favors for their particular causes in exchange for bringing a large block of voters. But the Tammany Hall group set their faces against Cleveland, I think because of this fear that they weren't going to get their handouts and appointments, even if he won. And therefore, what was the point? The opponent of Cleveland was a man named Blaine, and this led to some interesting dynamics. So, for example, I mentioned earlier that Grover Cleveland was raised in a very devout Reformed Presbyterian home where they kept the Sabbath and memorized the catechism and so forth. But this kind of came back to hurt him initially. So, for example, during the campaign, the Irish were already a pretty big factor, a voting bloc, and these were the Roman Catholic Irish that came over. The Scots Irish had come in earlier generations that were Presbyterians, but now the mainland Irish had come over in large numbers, and they were Roman Catholics. And so the Tammany Hall forces, in alliance now with Blaine, the Republican, our author says, skillfully both forces were tampering with the Irish, seeking to make it appear that Grover Cleveland was the irreconcilable enemy of their race, a bigoted Presbyterian, trained to consider the Church of Rome the scarlet woman of Holy Writ. So even though I don't really see a lot of evidence, at least in McElroy's narration, of a continuing hardcore Presbyterian set of convictions in Grover Cleveland, he still had that reputation, possibly because he was still, I think, a pious man, but more of a quiet piety, and he had that background. And so that was trying to be exploited to get the Irish vote to swing against him. However, amusingly, later on, one of the demagogues for the Republican Party was giving a speech in New York and let slip a phrase that came back to haunt them along the same lines, and that was, I'll read McElroy's description. The Irish vote in 1884 was, as now, of great importance, especially in the state of New York, and Mr. Blaine was in an advantageous position with reference to it, as his mother was a Roman Catholic. Toward the end of October, after a strenuous speech-making tour in the Middle West, Blaine arrived in New York, where he received at his quarters in the Fifth Avenue Hotel a delegation of clergymen, ardent reformers who had refused to follow their mugwump brethren into the Cleveland ranks. Unfortunately for the candidate whom they sought to serve, their leader, Dr. Samuel Burchard, was primed with an epic-making address. How epic-making he little suspected. Blaine seemed to listen, but his mind apparently wandered, for otherwise his trained political judgment would surely have suppressed the orator's finest phrase. "We are Republicans, and don't propose to leave our party and identify ourselves with the party whose antecedents have been Rome, Romanism, and rebellion." So there you see that the Democrats had been tagged with this moniker, Rum, Romanism, and rebellion. And of course, the rum refers to the fact that, well, first of all, Irish are known for loving to drink alcohol, but more specifically, the Republicans already had within their ranks temperance movements. These go back to the Second Great Awakening, actually. Efforts to pass national legislation to forbid the drinking of alcohol, which eventually in the 1910s actually came to fruition with the constitutional amendment for a time. So the Democrats were reviled as being the pro-rum party because they, as part of their history of being for the common man and for freedom and so forth, that was one thing they were tagged with. And then the Democrats, because they were more tolerant toward Roman Catholics and welcomed Irish into their ranks, and many Southerners also, like especially in New Orleans and places like that, Cajun region, had Roman Catholic influence. The Democrats were often ridiculed for Romanism, in other words, sympathy toward Romanism. Not that the majority were Roman, but just that they were tolerant and open-armed, welcoming to Romanists. And finally, rebellion, of course, referring to the secession of the Confederate States. And after the war, pretty much all of the South consolidated as what was known as the Solid South, and voted predictably Democrat for a very long time. So this Republican trying to key on these monikers tagging the Democratic Party, Rum, Rebellion, Rum, Romanism, and Rebellion, actually ended up tweaking the nose of the Irish the wrong way, and possibly cost them that faction of the New York vote. And as we'll see in a second, the New York vote was a big part of the whole election. So the election itself finally came, and it's interesting to our current situation because there again you had a swing state. Now we have several swing states, meaning states which, depending which way they go, will determine the outcome of the election. So in this case, New York itself was the swing state. You had, for the Democrats, the Solid South, and the Solid South included not only the Confederate proper, but the so-called border states. So Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, and West Virginia were all part of that Solid South coalition. Just as a quick side note, when Lincoln allowed the certain counties of Western Virginia to be picked off and formed into a separate state from Virginia under Republican manipulation, after the war, I suspect the Virginians did not contest what had happened too much, because they were probably thinking, well, I guess we get 4 Democrats instead of just 2 Democrats. So, it's one of these things where there's kind of an unintended consequence of political machinations. But anyhow, the Solid South reliably came in quickly for the Democrat, and then New Jersey, Indiana, and Connecticut. So pretty much the Yankee and Middle West, upper Middle West states and California were all solidly Republican, but New Jersey and Connecticut were kind of a salient into New England, and then Indiana, with New York becoming the kingmaker, essentially. And it was taking a long time for the New York vote to be settled. It kind of, again, reminds us of recent elections and possibly this upcoming election. And there was also a lot of murmurings that this would be another revisitation of the 1776, where Tilden was believed by most people to have won the election, but through Republican skullduggery and trickery had made it look like several southern states had voted for the Republican. And there was danger at that time of actually a rekindling of the Civil War. I mean, that's how bad it was. And a compromise was worked out whereby the southern states would concede Rutherford B. Hayes in exchange for ending the military occupation of the South. So it was a good deal for everybody. But now with this possible corruption going on in the New York election, there was murmurings that the same thing might be happening again. McElroy writes on page 97, the newspaper The Sun, then a Greenbacker and therefore no friend of Mr. Cleveland, conceded his election. But the Associated Press, which received returns not by counties but by election districts, insisted that it was a Republican victory. Mr. Cleveland wisely kept his own counsel and waited for a definite verdict. 3 days later, the leading New York City dailies, with the exception of the Tribune, agreed that Cleveland had been chosen. Republican politicians, however, accepted the view of the Tribune that Blaine was elected. And the Democrats became alarmed, recalling the election of 1876, when their opponents had snatched victory from their hands by counting out Samuel J. Tilden, the choice of the nation. Perhaps, they whispered, that game is to be tried again. When the Republican National Committee, in spite of the inconclusive returns, boldly declared, there is no ground for doubt that the honest vote of this state has been given to the Republican candidate, hot-headed Democrats talked of violence. The streets of New York took on a dangerously tense atmosphere as the eager crowds, waiting for further returns, called for the hanging of Jay Gould and manifested other tendencies disconcerting to Blaine's supporters. But in any case, the election was finally conceded to the Democrats. Grover Cleveland became the president-elect, and then that January assumed office in his first term. Okay, well, with that, I think I'll stop this video, and I'll do the review of Grover Cleveland's first term as president in a follow-up video that I'll try to do within the next few days. There's a few details of his administration, like Indian affairs and his dealings with the Samoan Islands, that still have repercussions to this day, as well as contrasting the politics, some similarities and differences to today that we can learn from. So I'd like to take that in a more leisurely way, and I don't want any given video to become too long and tedious. So with that, let's stop this one, and we'll continue soon.